In 1991, the American automotive industry had a problem it didn't know it had. Pickup trucks were supposed to haul equipment, carry tools, tow trailers, and survive hard work. Sports cars were supposed to go fast. Those two worlds weren't supposed to overlap. Then GMC built something that completely destroyed that logic. It was called the Syclone, and at first glance, it looked like nothing more than a small pickup truck with an attitude problem. But underneath that compact body was a turbocharged 4.3-liter V6, a sophisticated all-wheel drive system, and enough performance to embarrass cars that cost several times more. The strangest part wasn't that GMC had built a fast truck. The strangest part was how fast it actually was. Road tests recorded 0 to 60 miles per hour in roughly the low 4-second range, putting the Syclone into territory normally reserved for serious sports cars. And this wasn't some stripped-down racing prototype that couldn't be driven on the street. It had a bed, 2 seats, air conditioning, power accessories, and all the things you would expect from a normal GMC pickup. It was a working truck that had somehow learned how to launch like a sports car. To understand why something this ridiculous existed, you have to go back to the late 1980s, when a small group of engineers and performance enthusiasts began experimenting with GMC's compact Sonoma pickup. The idea wasn't born from a massive corporate strategy. It came from people who looked at an ordinary truck and wondered what would happen if they stopped treating it like an ordinary truck. GMC already had a compact pickup platform that was relatively light and easy to modify. The challenge was figuring out how to turn it into something genuinely fast without destroying its drivability. The answer came from turbocharging. Instead of dropping a massive V8 under the hood, engineers worked with the 4.3-liter V6. Turbocharging allowed them to extract dramatically more performance without the enormous weight and packaging problems associated with a big block engine. But horsepower alone wouldn't make the Syclone special. A powerful rear-wheel drive pickup could easily turn its rear tires into smoke. What GMC needed was traction. And that's where the project became truly unusual. The Syclone received an all-wheel drive system capable of sending power to all 4 wheels, giving the little truck something most performance pickups of the era simply didn't have, the ability to put its power down from a standstill. That decision transformed the truck. Instead of wasting its acceleration in wheel spin, the Syclone could launch hard and immediately convert its turbocharged torque into forward motion. The result was so unexpected that journalists initially struggled to believe the numbers. This wasn't supposed to happen. A compact pickup shouldn't be running alongside Corvettes. It shouldn't be challenging European sports cars. And yet, when the stopwatch came out, the joke disappeared. The Syclone was genuinely fast. GMC had accidentally created one of the most ridiculous performance vehicles of its generation. But there was another reason the Syclone became so special. It wasn't trying to look like a Ferrari. It still looked like a pickup. The lowered suspension, aggressive wheels, black exterior, ground-hugging stance, and subtle aerodynamic changes gave it a sinister appearance without completely hiding its humble origins. From a distance, you could mistake it for a modified Sonoma. That was part of the magic. The Syclone didn't need to announce what it could do. It could simply sit at a traffic light looking like a small work truck, and then disappear when the light turned green. And soon, people outside GMC began asking the same question: who exactly thought it was a good idea to make a pickup this fast? The answer would lead to one of the strangest chapters in American performance car history. But making the Syclone quick was only the beginning. Making it launch, corner, stop, and survive like a real production vehicle was a completely different challenge. GMC had created something that violated almost every traditional rule of performance car engineering. The truck was based on a compact pickup, it carried a turbocharged V6 instead of a purpose-built sports car engine, and it still had a usable cargo bed behind the cabin. Yet somehow, the engineers had turned those compromises into advantages. The relatively compact body helped keep weight under control, while the turbocharger gave the 4.3-liter V6 a huge increase in performance without requiring a massive engine bay. More importantly, the all-wheel drive system gave the Syclone something that most muscle cars of the era simply couldn't match: traction. When the turbocharged engine began producing its torque, all 4 wheels could work together to move the truck forward. That made the Syclone brutally effective from a standstill. It wasn't just fast once it was moving. It was fast immediately. And that difference mattered. Tests put the Syclone at around 4.3 seconds from 0 to 60 miles per hour, depending on conditions and testing method. That was astonishing for 1991. To put that into perspective, you could walk into a GMC dealership and buy a pickup that could accelerate harder than many dedicated sports cars. The comparison that made the headlines was the Chevrolet Corvette. The Corvette had been engineered for performance from the beginning. It had a low body, a purpose-built sports car chassis, a powerful V8, and decades of racing heritage behind its name. The Syclone had none of that. It had a bed. And yet, in straight-line acceleration, the little GMC could run with it. That absurd contrast became the entire personality of the Syclone. It wasn't necessarily the fastest car in every situation, and it wasn't designed to replace a Corvette on a racetrack. Its real weapon was the shock factor. Nobody expected it. You could be sitting beside a sports car at a traffic light, looking like the least threatening vehicle on the road, and then suddenly the truck would launch forward with all four tires clawing for grip. The driver in the sports car might have had more horsepower, better aerodynamics, and a much higher top speed, but none of that mattered during the first few seconds. The Syclone had already disappeared. GMC also understood that simply adding power wasn't enough. The suspension was heavily modified, the truck was lowered dramatically compared with a conventional Sonoma, and the brakes were upgraded to deal with the additional performance. The result was a vehicle that looked almost cartoonishly low next to ordinary pickups. The Syclone sat closer to the pavement, wore larger wheels and tires, and had a stance that immediately communicated that something wasn't normal. Inside, however, the experience remained surprisingly familiar. There wasn't a hand-built supercar cabin or exotic carbon fiber. It was still unmistakably a GMC pickup from the early 1990s. That's what made the contrast even better. You could sit inside, look at the dashboard, see the ordinary controls, and almost forget what was sitting underneath the hood. Then the turbocharger would spool up, the automatic transmission would shift, and the entire character of the vehicle would change. And yes, the Syclone used an automatic transmission. For traditional performance enthusiasts, that might sound like a weakness. In reality, it helped make the truck brutally consistent. The drivetrain could deliver its power without requiring the driver to manage clutch engagement or gear changes during hard launches. Combined with all-wheel drive, it created exactly what GMC wanted, a machine that could produce astonishing acceleration almost effortlessly. But there was a price for all of this engineering. The Syclone wasn't cheap. GMC was taking a relatively ordinary compact pickup and transforming almost every major performance component. Turbocharging, intercooling, all-wheel drive, suspension modifications, braking upgrades, wheels, tires, and extensive engineering work all added cost. This wasn't something GMC could simply build alongside thousands of standard Sonomas and expect it to remain inexpensive. Production was therefore extremely limited. Approximately 2,995 Syclones were built for the 1991 model year, making it an unusual sight even when it was new. That scarcity would eventually become part of its legend. But at the time, GMC wasn't trying to create a collectible. The company wanted attention. And it got exactly that. Automotive magazines began testing the truck against vehicles that had no business being compared with a pickup. Suddenly, the Syclone wasn't just a strange GMC product. It was a statement. American manufacturers were showing that performance didn't have to come in the traditional shape of a sports car. Speed could come from anywhere, even from a small pickup truck. And once GMC discovered what was possible, the company wasn't finished. Because if one turbocharged pickup could shock the world, the next question was obvious: what if they built an SUV with the same philosophy? That question would lead directly to another legendary machine, and prove that the Syclone wasn't a one-time accident. It was the beginning of something much bigger. The Syclone should have been a ridiculous experiment that disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived. Instead, it became one of the most memorable performance vehicles of the early 1990s. GMC had taken a compact pickup, added a turbocharged V6, sophisticated all-wheel drive, serious suspension upgrades, and enough engineering to make the whole combination work, and then sold it to the public. But perhaps the most important thing about the Syclone wasn't its acceleration. It was what the truck represented. At a time when performance cars were becoming increasingly sophisticated, the Syclone proved that speed didn't have to come in a predictable package. It didn't need a long hood, 2 seats, and a low roof to be exciting. It could have a cargo bed. It could look like a work truck. It could even be practical. And that idea was powerful enough to inspire an entire generation of performance pickups. The Syclone's influence became even clearer when GMC followed it with the Typhoon, essentially applying the same philosophy to an SUV. The Typhoon kept the turbocharged 4.3-liter V6 and all-wheel drive concept but wrapped it in a more practical body. Suddenly, GMC had created something that looked like an ordinary family SUV but possessed acceleration comparable to serious sports cars. Together, the Syclone and Typhoon became the foundation of a new American performance category. They demonstrated that trucks and SUVs didn't have to be slow, heavy utility vehicles. They could be genuinely fast. the Syclone itself remained incredibly rare. With fewer than 3,000 examples produced, most people never had the opportunity to see one in person, let alone drive one. That rarity only strengthened its reputation as the years passed. Enthusiasts began searching for surviving examples, collectors started preserving them, and modified trucks became increasingly common as people discovered just how much potential the turbocharged 4.3-liter engine possessed. Yet the original Syclone remained special because it wasn't created by the aftermarket. GMC built it. It came from a major manufacturer with a warranty, a production line, and a dealer network. That fact alone makes the truck remarkable. Think about what GMC had actually done. They didn't simply install a powerful engine into a pickup and call it a day. They created a complete performance package with turbocharging, intercooling, all-wheel drive, upgraded suspension, larger brakes, specialized wheels and tires, and a lowered chassis. Everything had to work together. And somehow, it did. The Syclone wasn't perfect. Its small cabin, limited practicality, relatively high fuel consumption, and specialized nature meant it could never become a mass-market vehicle. Its cargo bed wasn't exactly useful for hauling heavy loads, and its low suspension made it fundamentally different from a normal work truck. But those weaknesses were almost irrelevant because the Syclone was never meant to be an ordinary pickup. It was a statement. It existed to answer a question nobody had asked: what happens if a truck is built like a sports car? And the answer was faster than almost anyone expected. Today, the GMC Syclone is remembered as one of the most important American performance trucks ever produced. Not because it sold millions. It didn't. Not because it dominated motorsport. It wasn't built for that. And not because it was the most powerful vehicle of its era. It wasn't. Its legacy comes from something much simpler. It shocked people. In 1991, a small black GMC pickup could pull up next to a Corvette and genuinely make the driver nervous. That shouldn't have been possible. A truck wasn't supposed to accelerate like that. A truck wasn't supposed to have all-wheel drive and a turbocharged V6 engineered specifically for performance. And a truck certainly wasn't supposed to become a collector's item. But the Syclone did all three. More than 30 years later, its formula still feels strangely modern. Powerful turbocharged engines, all-wheel drive, performance suspension, and enormous acceleration are now common in SUVs and trucks costing six figures. But GMC was experimenting with that idea decades earlier, when almost nobody knew where the market was heading. That's why the Syclone deserves to be remembered. It wasn't simply a fast pickup. It was a warning shot. It showed the automotive world that the boundaries between trucks and sports cars were beginning to disappear. And perhaps that's the most ironic part of the entire story. GMC built the Syclone as a tiny experiment, but the idea it represented would eventually become an enormous part of the performance car industry. Today, when you see a high-performance pickup launch harder than a sports car, the concept doesn't seem strange anymore. But in 1991, it was almost unbelievable. And that's exactly why the little GMC Syclone became legendary. Because sometimes the cars that make the biggest impact aren't the ones that follow the rules. They're the ones that make everyone wonder who thought breaking them was a good idea.